Don was my friend. He was a member of the church I served, and we sang in the choir together. He grew up Catholic and loved to sing the anthems in Latin. He was in his 50s and had fought lung cancer for 2 years. Don's strife was over now, and I was privileged to sit with him on what would be his last night on this earth. That same night, the choir was having a gathering, and when I left the hospital, I just needed to be with choir people. And so I went over to this gathering. And at one point, the person whose house it was asked me, "What's it like to be with someone who is dying, especially when you love them?" That question, I think, is a good way to enter this morning's text. The passage tells part of the story of Mary Magdalene, who, unlike others who had fled the scene when the going got tough, Mary had stayed near Jesus and had watched him in the final hours of his life. Many of us here know that experience all too well. It is both a sacred and a painful place. The hours can turn into days, weeks even. You find yourself wanting to be anywhere but there, but you also find that you don't want to be anywhere else. You pay attention to small moans, changes in breathing patterns. You take a small pink sponge on a stick and you moisten her lips. If he's in pain, you are grateful for the narcotics that take the edge off. All of these little things matter as you wait. The breathing spaces itself out and soon stops. It is finished. Our mood shifts between relief and deep sadness. Some of us don't need to see this. Others of us can't be anywhere else. If you have ever found yourself there, then I expect your emotions were not far from Mary Magdalene's. As she went to that place where Jesus' body had laid, you remember what happened? She had watched Jesus and how he had been hung on the cross and how they had cast lots for his clothing and had pierced his side. And Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had taken his body and laid it in the tomb. It was still dark when Mary got to the tomb and saw that the stone had been rolled away. And she ran back to tell the others, and Peter and the other disciple raced back to the tomb to see for themselves. And one disciple stopped outside the tomb but looked in to see the linen cloths lying there. Peter, always the bold one, went inside the tomb and saw the same thing. The linen cloths that had once wrapped Jesus' body were folded neatly in the corner. And then we're told they went home. Mary, though, didn't. She is the one who lingers, weeping outside the tomb. It's the women, you know. It's the women who so often stay to the end. Mary peers into the tomb, sees the two angels in white. They say, "Woman, why are you weeping?" "They've taken away my Lord," she answers. For Mary, the world was still a dark and violent and dangerous place. And she turns, and standing there is Jesus, but she doesn't recognize him. He asks her the same question the angels did. "Woman, why are you weeping?" She thinks he's the gardener until he calls her by name and tells her that she can't hold on to him anymore. Once the stone has been rolled away and Jesus has broken free, it is resurrection time and things are different. Jesus has left the tomb. And I think what Mary does at this point is pretty incredible. She leaves the tomb, goes back to the disciples, and she says, "I have seen the Lord. I have seen the Lord." Mary's words were not only, I think, the very first Christian sermon ever preached. Those 5 words, "I have seen the Lord," may be the best sermon ever preached. And I wonder if you and I can preach that sermon. In a world that was dark and violent and dangerous, Mary saw the Lord. If in dark and dangerous times you and I can say, "I have seen the Lord," then with Mary we will truly hear the good news of Easter morning, and we will have shared it by others simply by declaring that word. When I'm asked, as I sometimes am, if I believe in the resurrection, I say yes, I do, for 2 reasons. And the first is simply the historical witness. It's the documented enthusiasm of the disciples. And historians and theologians may quibble over whether or not there actually was a bodily resurrection. Remember, Mary didn't recognize him. But no one disputes the fact that the disciples became 10 times the people they were before the resurrection. Peter, who could break a promise as easily as he could make it, who denied Jesus 3 times in his hour of need after the resurrection, became the one upon whom Jesus built the church. The enthusiasm of the disciples exploded across a continent after the resurrection. In fact, our word enthusiasm comes from the Latin word which means possessed or inspired by God. Theos, meaning God. That's what happened to the disciples after the resurrection. So much so that we can say that Christianity began with Mary's sermon on Easter morning. No resurrection means no Gospels, means no New Testament, means no church. To say Christ is risen is more than a memory that will never die, more than a cause that will live on. To Peter, Andrew, James, John, and the others, Christ was a real presence from that time forth. And so the first reason I believe in the resurrection is the witness of the disciples. And frankly, the presence of the Christian church, which if it didn't have the presence of Christ in its midst, would have petered out a long time ago. Second reason I believe in the resurrection is that, like so many others, I have experienced the presence of Christ in my own life. And I have seen it in others. I have known forgiveness in my life when I did nothing to deserve it. And the only thing I can credit it to is Christ's presence and Christ's mercy. More than once I have been supported by others when I wasn't able to support myself. I have seen the presence of Christ in others when money that used to go toward way too much alcohol was turned into monthly rent and food and savings. I have seen people reunited when the bond of love has been broken. I have experienced the risen Christ as strength above my own, as courage above my own, as a joy that is deeper than any grief the world gives. And I have experienced the risen Christ in some of you, in the ways you have made it through some extraordinarily challenging times. Most often, I experience the risen Christ as love. Love for one another, to be sure, but also love for those Jesus called the least of these. What that means, dear people, is that Easter faith is available to everyone in this church, to those who believe and to all among us who have ever doubted. Fortunately or not, I am a Yankees fan. And since baseball season opened this week, I thought a baseball story would be in order. The Yankees, as I'm sure you all know, are 2-1 on the season so far. And with a .667 average, they are clearly on their way to a division championship this year. But the story is about Phil Rizzuto, who played for the Yankees for 13 years and then was their broadcaster for 40 years. And one day, a colleague in the broadcaster's booth looked at Rizzuto's scorecard when he kept score by hand, and he saw WW. What's WW? He asked. And Rizzuto replied, "It means I wasn't watching." Sometimes We have to watch for God at work in our lives. To look for the presence of Christ in the midst of a crazy and mixed up world. But signs of his presence are out there. You might have seen the story, but a week ago on Friday, a lone gunman walked into a small local grocery store in a small town in southern France. It was a place that ordinary enough that any of us might have found ourselves there. He killed 3 people and held a woman hostage. She was a cashier at the store. At one point, Arnaud Beltrame, a 44-year-old officer with the French gendarme, entered the store with his hands above his head, setting down his gun and his cell phone, persuaded the gunman who was holding the woman as a shield with a gun to her head to let the woman go. And she walked out of the store. Several minutes later, shots rang out. A SWAT team stormed the store and killed the gunman. Lieutenant Colonel Arnaud Beltrame had been shot and stabbed in the neck, and he died in the hospital a short while later. One woman said later, "I'm thinking about the family of the butcher, about the customer who died for nothing, and about the colonel who sacrificed himself for us, and that had he not done that, he would be among us." It's a story of how a familiar place can be turned into a violent and frightening place. Officer Beltrame gave his life so that another might live. Our world, like Mary's, can be dark and violent and dangerous. But this is the world Christ came to redeem. And in his resurrection, there is nothing that can stop his final victory over all that would do us harm. To say I have seen the Lord doesn't mean you have to find the busiest street corner or a jam-packed mall and yell it out for every passerby to hear. It doesn't mean putting John 3:16 on a banner and going to a baseball or football team and hanging it over the rails. To say I have seen the Lord is simply to see the possibility of life when so much of what is out there is decay. To identify love in the face of fear and hate. To lift up decency and goodness when everything that is angry and reactive seems to find more followers every day. In the end, resurrection is not only the promise of life after death, which would be enough, frankly, but resurrection is also the assurance that the life-giving love of God will always, always roll the stone away. Tombs are just that, containers for the dead. And these days, when so much of the news is filled with cold and heartless places of fear, bitterness, and judgment, God continues to roll the stone away. And when the stale air of decay meets the living Spirit of God that creates the possibility of hope and of peace, death truly is no more. And you and I can finally step out of that tomb and again into the light of Christ. We can step into a place where we can breathe again because the air is fresh and clean. And we can say, I have seen the Lord. Maybe for you. Maybe for you. There is someone in your life who is not able to say, I have seen the Lord, because they just can't. And the reason they can't is that they have been inside the walls of a tomb for too long. And what they need is for you to be able to say something like, I may not understand, but I want you to know that I have seen the Lord and He understands. Even Mary didn't know it was Jesus when she first saw Him. Maybe what God is wanting from you this week is to help someone else see that He is risen. He is risen indeed. Mary's words to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. And look what happened to them. Margaret Rankle was raised in the Christian church. And in an article in the New York Times this week, She wrote that even during the hardest years, when mobilizing 3 young sons in various configurations, she says, of elderly parents, felt like running the Iditarod every single Sunday, even then she said, the family still got to church. And the first sentence of her article was this: I went to church on Easter Sunday last year and never went back. It wasn't a boycott, she said. It was just for her an inability to square the actions of many Christians and the church at large with her understanding of what the gospel message is supposed to be all about. So in her article, Margaret wrote that in college and graduate school she tried not to believe in God, but in the end she finally couldn't not believe. In time, she said, she found her way back to God, even if her understanding of God had grown beyond the church's ability to define it or contain it. But she realized that even though the church was an imperfect institution, her year away didn't make her miss the place. She didn't miss the trappings, she didn't miss the colors, she didn't even miss the building, as beautiful as it was. She missed being part of a congregation. She missed standing side by side with other people, eyes looking in the same direction, voices mumbling out the same prayers in a fallen world. She said she missed the wiggling babies smiling over their parents' shoulders, and she missed the singing. And the last paragraph of Margaret Rankel's article is this: So I will be at church again on Easter Sunday, as I have been almost every Easter of my life. I will remember the ones I loved who sat beside me in the pew and whose participation in the eternal has found another form, whatever that turns out to be. I will lift my voice in song and give thanks for my life. I will pray for my church and my country, especially for the people my church and my country are failing. And then I will walk into the world and do my best to practice resurrection. In a broken and battered world where people die and where some give their life so that others might live, by what you and I say and do, we can declare that we have seen the Lord. So when we leave this place, this Easter Sunday, may we, like Mary Magdalene, like Margaret Rankel, walk into the world and practice resurrection. Thanks be to God. Amen.